Okay, well, good morning to everyone here. Good morning to everybody online. It's good to go through this passage with you this morning. So what we just heard was Isaiah chapter 6, which was his kind of picture and encounter with God. So I want to start with the exercise this morning. If I could all ask you to just close your eyes, please. Close them and ask you a question in a second. I want you to picture God. Okay, what comes into your mind when you picture God? I think some people are going to come up with some sort of a light or a fuzzy thing. Some people might picture Jesus. Some people might picture baby Jesus in a manger. It's probably going to be a variety of pictures that we're going to come up with here. So get that picture, and then you may now open your eyes and compare that with what Isaiah saw. Okay, that was his picture of God. That was his encounter that he had through a vision. We're going to see that what he saw is very rich with a lot of meaning for us this morning. It teaches us a lot about God. I think it teaches us a lot about where we are as people and what needs to happen for us people who aren't perfect. We're going to be, have sin in our own lives, full of stuff that isn't good. How are we going to get to a place where we approach God? So let's go through this passage. It's pretty weird. There's a lot happening. There's like weird images. It's random in places. I'm going to take us through it. Hopefully it can give us an idea of what's happening, what Isaiah is kind of thinking when he sees this stuff, and why God gave him this vision. So what we're meant to take away, this whole picture, every detail in this is there to communicate to Isaiah that he's in the direct presence of God. Now, if you kind of went back in time and you lived, 2,500 years ago, and you read this, all this stuff would be communicating to you that this person, Isaiah, is right next to God at this point. You'd probably be thinking, yes, God's everywhere. Yes, God is, with me when I'm walking down the road. If you're an Israelite, you'd be thinking, yes, God's also kind of specially in the temple. But what Isaiah sees is there's no barrier between him and God. He's right up close. He gets this vision of, or a dream, whatever it is, of God sitting in his throne in the temple, heavenly temple, surrounded by these things called seraphim. So let's talk a little bit about what these things are. Let's go next slide. I'll give you the quick version. These are what we would probably call angels. I think that's kind of cheating a little bit, but hopefully that gets you on the right idea. Angels in the Bible usually do something though. They have a message or they've got a task that they need to do. These things aren't called angels. Usually in the Bible as well, angels actually appear as like people. So you might remember at the end of the Gospel of Mark, there's a man standing outside the tomb talking to the women. Lots of times they appear as normal people, but these things are obviously not normal people. These things that Isaiah sees are beings that kind of have a very special job. It would have left no doubt in Isaiah's mind about where he was. So I want you to think about this, another picture. Imagine you're walking through a building or a hallway somewhere. Maybe you're going for an appointment, doctor's appointment. You don't quite know where the room is. You're walking through this hallway and you start realizing that you're a bit lost. So you're wondering where you are. You enter one door, you go into a room, and you see on the other side of that room is another door. Okay, it's closed. You see in front of the door 4 soldiers. They're all armed to the teeth. They've got assault rifles, all that sort of thing. When you step in the door, they all look up and they stare at you. And they point their guns and say, "How did you get in here? What are you doing?" You would just be freaking out. You'd be thinking, "Whoa, I'm sorry. I did not mean to be here." You'd be backing up. You'd be saying, "I'm sorry." But you would definitely have an idea or a sense that what you walked into is a place that you weren't meant to be. Everything about that room would communicate that to you, okay? Soldiers, guns, yes, you're not meant to be there. That's what I think Isaiah is experiencing. When he sees these things, that's what he's picturing. I'm not meant to be here. This is not my space. These are beings that live only in God's presence. And their entire existence is just to serve as that kind of final barrier between God and people. Now, when you step past these things, you're actually at God, is the way it kind of works. Now, this isn't a physical place. It's a throne vision of God. So you can't really step past them, but you kind of get the idea of being communicated. It's very metaphorical and symbolic, but there's a truth there. So how Isaiah describes them is quite fascinating as well. So they're covered in these wings. Each pair's doing a different thing. The word he uses for them is seraphim, which is a word that's actually untranslated from the Hebrew. So that's the exact word. If you can say the word seraphim, you know a little bit of Hebrew, so good on you. It's a word that elsewhere in the Bible just means snakes, or like almost like a poisonous snake. Isaiah uses it elsewhere as well in his book, and it's a venomous snake basically. Now that sounds very weird. So I've got a few questions when I come across that. I go, why would Isaiah be describing them as snakes? Like, what's happening here? What's going through his head when he comes back and writes this down and says that this is what they look like? Second question might be, I think it might be the better question, why would God give Isaiah a vision of this, represented as snakes? What would be the purpose? Is it just to confuse him? Is it to confuse us? What is happening? My best shot at that is that Isaiah would have understood what these things are. He would have seen them and he would have known culturally that's what these beings do. They guard God. The image is common from back then, several thousand years ago. We find snakes on like little inscriptions and paintings and stuff around Israel. In this context, we see them down in Egypt. So culturally, that's what they're thinking. Apparently, it was a way for them to represent beings that didn't have bodies, but they needed to obviously put something down. So that's what they chose. So our culture might put, if I put up a picture here of a lovable, cute baby with wings, a naked thing, and it had like a bow and arrow, you'd know that I'm trying to mean an angel. But that's a very culturally bounded image that we use. Back then, a variety of images and metaphors, one of which was a snake. Now, let's jump over to the next slide. This is a very cool thing. This is a sketch or like a drawing of a little seal that was found in Jerusalem back in the time of Isaiah, actually. So dated back to then. Dated actually about maybe around 20 years after this vision happens. It belonged to a person called Ashna, and the writing down the bottom says that it says like of Ashna of the court of King Ahaz. Now, obviously the most important bit is that drawing there in the middle. You've got like a circle there representing God, and you've got these snake figures around it, around God. Now, this is fascinating to me because in the book of Isaiah, you read that Isaiah actually had a lot of influence in the court of the king in Israel. So there's absolutely every chance in the world that this person who wrote this or used this as like a stamp, Ashna, knew Isaiah personally. What we have here is the scene that Isaiah describes as well. It's not every day that you kind of get some sort of physical evidence, but this little clay stamp thing is something that they found dated back to that time. So I think Isaiah's vision probably inspired this scene that we see here. So how does this relate to other parts of the Bible though? I want to kind of take a step back. I agree it's a weird image. So what do we do with it? I think it kind of sheds some light on the other parts of the Bible that we read where a similar thing happens. So in the Old Testament as well, the prophet Ezekiel had similar visions, but he reported back that he saw these things that he called cherubim. And these were these weird beast animal mixture things. Very weird, like, the head of a person, the body of a lion, all that sort of thing. His context was exile. And I think that vision would have shown him the exact same thing that Isaiah got told. I'm approaching the throne of God. In the book of Revelation, John sees different beasts with different descriptions. I think it would have communicated the same thing to him. I'm at the throne of God when I'm experiencing these things. These are the things that you see that when you see them, you know you're in some place special. It's kind of that you've walked into the room, the soldiers are pointing the guns at you, they're saying, how did you get in here? Now, that's kind of helpful to me to kind of get those different pictures and put them together. It probably means, I'd say it certainly means we're not dealing with literal descriptions or physical things here. It's refreshing to know because that's kind of a weird idea of God being surrounded by snakes. But the idea that's being communicated is the same across all those images. So we move on a little bit, and we hear that Isaiah comes into this scene and he's terrified, okay? He sees these seraphim covered in wings. They're chanting about God in his holiness, and he just freaks out. He's stepped through the door. He's found himself in the president's bedroom or whatever, and he's in trouble. This wasn't an accident, though. He's been summoned by God for a reason. Now, I can't help but find it's a little bit funny that there's this idea that we find in the Bible and maybe in some of our songs as well, that we just want to be near to God, and, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. And if we could just get the presence of God, that would be fantastic. Isaiah gets that. He is given that experience and he freaks out. He's convinced he's going to die. He says he's done for. He knows it. He kind of starts speaking. He says, I'm a person of unclean lips. I've said things, I've done things. I'm not meant to be here. This is not my space. Now, I don't think it was that Isaiah was a particularly bad person or anything, but he's acknowledging that the culture around him, which influences him, has made him into a person who is full of corruption. He realizes that when you get close to God. I think we could say the same about ourselves in Sydney. We're not a perfect people at all. I'm not perfect. The rest of Sydney is definitely not perfect. And for Isaiah, that's about to become a big problem. What happens next, though, is fascinating. One of these beings comes over to Isaiah carrying a burning piece of coal. It's an intense picture. Just forget that we know kind of what happens later in the chapter. Let's just snapshot right here. You'd be thinking he's dead, right? This thing's flying at him with a piece of fire. He's about to get incinerated. Now, yes, it's a vision or whatever, it's a dream, but what happens is the coal is put on his lips. He's probably got his eyes closed at this point. It's put on his lips and it sears him. Now, it's probably not a pleasant experience, right? Having your lips seared with a piece of coal. Probably would have burned him a little bit. It might have hurt. Then this voice comes out though. Your guilt is taken away and your sin is atoned for. He's been forgiven. Somehow this piece of coal touching Isaiah is making him pure. Now that's remarkable because in the Bible, normally if you touch something impure, especially in the Old Testament, its impurity comes over to you. So we know how this works, right? This is just probably the way that we would default into. Now, every good sermon these days has to have a coronavirus example. So I've got one here. When you come into contact with someone with coronavirus, it's going to come onto you, right? Unless you do all the social distancing stuff. If you cough into your hand and you touch a door handle, that door handle is going to have coronavirus infection on it. The fact that the door handle is clean doesn't make you clean. It doesn't cure you. The infection's going one way. Okay, it's coming out from you. Now, you can make a place completely clean. It can be free of dust, whatever. If you cough on it, it's going to go onto you. The fact that it's clean doesn't cure you by any stretch of the imagination. Very similar logic in the Bible as well. If you touch something like a dead body or something, the fact that you do that means that you're kind of associated with death and you're no longer allowed to walk and serve in the temple for a period. Okay, they have to go through this whole stuff to become pure again. Its impurity stays on you for a while, though. It's usually a time period that you have to wait. But in Isaiah 6, there's this new idea that's produced in the Bible. You have this coal that's very holy and pure, and it's an object, and it transfers its pureness across to Isaiah. Isaiah is not destroyed by God's goodness in this instance. Instead, he's transformed by it. So that happens. The question is then asked, who wants to be a prophet, basically? Put your hand up. And so Isaiah's like, well, me, I guess. So God tells Isaiah to go out and be a prophet. He tells the people what they're doing is wrong. He's going to be a witness against the nation of Judah. They need to turn back to God. But God knows the people. He knows it's not going to happen, basically. Now, I don't know about you, but usually when I'm given a task, I need to know if I can do it, okay? If I think I won't be able to do it, if you just tell me to do something impossible, I'm not going to try. But unfortunately, that's what Isaiah gets to hear. He says, go be a prophet, but it's not going to work. That's pretty probably deflating for Isaiah. Now, that's what's given to him. That's what tasked to him. It's not that he wouldn't be any good. He probably was a fantastic prophet, very skilled, nice speaker. But the people were not going to listen to him. God tells him that at the start. So in a way, Isaiah's ministry then isn't to kind of bring them back because God knows it's not going to work. It's to act as a witness against them. One big fat judgment against the nation. God saying, I gave you actually one of the best prophets and you still didn't listen. So God says exile is going to come. So how does this relate to Jesus then? In a very surprising way, actually. Even in the midst of this judgment, God promises to leave a little spark of hope. Let's go next slide. The nation of Judah where Isaiah lived, it's kind of used this picture of a big tree, okay? Let's think of Judah as a big tree. The tree is going to get cut down. But out of the stump that is left, there's going to be a little bit of hope, a holy seed that's going to come up. This represents the children of King David. This line is going to continue down through the centuries until the New Testament, where we learn that Jesus is one of the descendants of David. When Jesus comes claiming to be the Messiah, what he's claiming is that he's fulfilling these passages, like Isaiah 6, where God promises a king would come to rule forever. He's the holy seed that comes out of the stump. But Jesus is also probably in this passage in a way that you might not expect. In John 12, from the Gospel of John, Jesus is facing some unbelief from the people. John brings up two passages from Isaiah, from the book of Isaiah. He quotes them, saying that Jesus fulfills them. First is from Isaiah chapter 53. Second is from what we just read this morning. Now, Isaiah 53, great messianic passage, talking about one who would come, would be put to death, would be, see life again, would bring redemption for the people. You read it, it's just very clearly about Jesus. Jesus fulfills that one very nicely. But then John says something really interesting at the bottom here. In John 12, he says, Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him. So the question is, what is John thinking here? It could be about Isaiah 53. Maybe it's about the book in general, like he's just kind of taking a step back and saying this is generally about Jesus. Now, possibly, but I think actually he's talking about the bit where he mentions just before, where he quotes from Isaiah chapter 6. A very good case that what he's thinking is that Isaiah saw God's glory as Jesus' glory. The reason I think that is there's no other passage in Isaiah where we get told that Isaiah sees God's glory. But here, as we heard this morning, it starts off by saying, I saw the Lord. I saw his glory. Now, this would be a very strange thing for John and Isaiah to say, though. When after reading Isaiah, he says, I saw God. And John's already told us at the start of the gospel that no one's ever seen God. I don't know how you'd put that together. But what John does is, he kind of says, when Isaiah was seeing that vision of the Lord on the throne, what he was seeing was Jesus' glory. I can imagine John reading that, or probably most likely hearing Isaiah read out, and hearing that passage. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne. And John was thinking, yep, Isaiah, I know what you mean. I saw the Lord too. Nice affinity they've got together. So that's what I've got to say about the passage. I've got 2 points for us to take away this morning. First is, I think we need to have this experience that Isaiah had. We need to see God as he really is. Probably not as what you pictured before when I asked you at the start to picture God. Not as a little baby in a manger at Christmas time. But having the sense of the awesomeness of God, of who he really is. I think there needs to be this healthy recognition that God is just so different from us. In our view of God, how we think about obeying him and following him, This aspect can't be forgotten. It seems like Isaiah forgot it a little bit in his life. It led him to follow the culture around him. He's a person of unclean lips because so is everyone else, basically. He lived as an average Israelite. Question to you is, do you want to live as an average Sydneyite? I don't know, that's not a word, but do you want to live as an average Sydneyite? Do you want to conform to the standard of your culture? Do you want to be like everyone else? Or do you want to have it based on Christ's love and truth? Best way to get there, I think, to be engaging with God is by, it's not the only way, I think it's the best way though, reading the Bible. How often? I reckon every week, every month, every year, until the day you die. You should do this because it's the best way to realign your priorities. And it's what God gave the church for our growth. So I figure if you can spend at least once a week on Netflix or YouTube or ABC or whatever it is, you've got time to spend in the Bible as well. I know for many of us, myself definitely included, it's more like every day we spend on those things. Now, if you're already doing that, fantastic, keep it up. Keep using it as a time of growth for you, to grow in faithfulness and love, and get that right picture of God. If you're not doing it, or if you were doing it but have stopped, let me encourage you to start. Either grab a physical Bible or on your phone or an audio Bible, whatever it is. Audio Bibles are the best. It's read to you. It's fantastic. But yeah, get into it. And I know it's hard. So I had probably a 6-year period where I was trying to pick it up as a habit. Every year, usually around New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, New Year's resolution would come along and I'd be like, this is going to be the year. And I did 6 times and I failed each time. February, it fizzles out a little bit. But for the last probably 3 years, I've found that rhythm. And so I've found that to be very, very helpful. So keep trying, keep going, find what works for you as well, and enjoy the growth that comes. Second point is, as the church, you need to be people, or we need to be people who will carry on Jesus' ability to clean people. As we saw from that coal touching Isaiah, and it being a holy object that makes people clean and whole, so too Jesus cleans us from sin. It's not a coincidence that the coal was taken from the altar, which is where the sacrifice was in the Old Testament. The sacrifice of Jesus is the way that we're made right with God. So just as Isaiah's burning coal moment changed him as well, it transformed him, we need to make sure that we don't allow the better sacrifice to pass us by. Let me pray for us. Dear Lord, thank you for Isaiah's vision and what it was. Thank you that it's weird. Thank you that we can discuss it. Pray this morning that going through it, we would be reminded that we need to have a good picture of you. We need to have a right picture of you ruling as our Lord, and one who is so different from everything else in existence. Pray that you can help us, engage with you through your word, read our Bibles, and be people who know Jesus, know the sacrifice that he gave, and are people who are transformed by it. Pray that we can also use this to help others around us to see you clearly, to see your love, to see that you are there, that you care for them, and that you sent your son for them. Amen.